your particular care. But these are the plagues which we need to be aware of. And I wonder what infection you are vulnerable to. So now, let's think about the Christian world. How we build this bridge. Let's dig deep into the Christian world. And where are we going to start? Well, I'd like to start in John chapter 20. It's a very special time. It was the evening on that day, the first day of the week, and the doors were shut where the disciples were for fear of the Jews. And Jesus came and stood in their midst and said to them, "Peace be with you." And he showed them his hands and his side. The disciples rejoiced when they saw the Lord. And then Jesus says to them, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I also send you." That's what the translations usually say. In fact, according to John Stott, it's stronger than that. What it's saying is, just as the Father has sent me, in the same way I am sending you. And that's the principle of what's sometimes called incarnational mission. So by looking at the way that Jesus was sent by the Father, we can learn about how we have been sent. So we're just briefly going to look at some headlines. First of all, Jesus was sent to serve. He voluntarily chose the role of a servant. Practical Christian caring is servant caring. And in John chapter 13, we learn something profound about Christ the servant. This is a sacred moment. Jesus is spending his last hours with the chosen few, and yet the evil one is in the room, in the heart of Judas Iscariot. And Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments and, taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. There are four things that Jesus knows utterly and unshakably. The hour had come. The Father had given all things into his hand. He had come from God. He was going back to God. This is what Jesus knows. With such power and status, you might expect him to defeat the devil in the room in an overwhelming burst of spiritual power and light. He might have blown Judas Iscariot away. Instead, he gets up from the table and he stoops to the floor and he washes his disciples' feet, including the feet of Judas. Washing feet was the most menial, lowly, despised occupation reserved for the lowest of the low. The streets of Jerusalem, like all crowded cities, were dirty, stinking. There was filth, disease, urine, excrement in the highways. It doesn't take much imagination to see why washing feet was a filthy and demeaning task. And some high-minded Jews insisted that Jewish slaves should not be required to wash the feet of others. It should only be for Gentiles. So you can see why the disciples are going to be absolutely shocked. Has he lost his mind? But the critical point is that John, writing the Gospel, makes a direct connection between Jesus' knowledge of who he is, his security, and his ability to take the lowest part. It's precisely because of Jesus' total security that he's able to lower himself to the role of a slave. And this is an example of the profound doctrine of kenosis, a Greek word meaning emptying, that Jesus empties himself. He becomes nothing and takes the form of a servant. He takes up the servant towel, he puts it round his waist, he looks and he takes on the garment and the appearance of the most menial house slave, and he starts the filthy task. Now here's a thought experiment. Imagine you yourself, and you're seriously ill. You're incontinent, you're lying in your own feces, your urine and your vomit, you're helpless and you're stinking, and you're being gently and tenderly washed and cleaned by the person of Christ himself. How would you feel? And this is the true nature of God revealed in the face of Jesus Christ. And I think it's amazing and interesting that Jesus washes the feet of Judas as well. He doesn't just confine himself to nice people, to grateful people, to the chosen ones. He washes the feet of the unlovely and the hostile and the wicked and the abusive and the one dedicated to destroy him. What majestic power. How could he do it? He did it because he knew who he was. And then he goes on and he says, do you understand what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. You should do exactly what I have done to you. But in the same way, we cannot take the lowest place unless we are rooted and secure in the knowledge and security of our own status. To be forced to take that lowest role is damaging and abusive and destructive. But to choose like Jesus, voluntarily, motivated by love and out of the security of our own, knowing our own self-status, as dearly loved daughters and sons of the King, that is totally different. And Christ's action is motivated by free agape love. It's not coerced or manipulated or even driven by a sense of duty. It is totally free and uncoerced. And although it's not in the passage, my guess is it was also motivated by joy. It was joy, bubbling, inexpressible, eternal joy that motivated Jesus to take on the role of the slave. So it's interesting, isn't it? You could look at two slaves. One is a forced, compelled house slave, and they are demeaned and destroyed. They're human trash. And another is a Christian servant who has voluntarily chosen that role. And from the outside, they look exactly the same. But internally, it's totally different. And it's because of the heart. It's because of the Christ-like example. And, you know, Jesus' example, and this passage in John, was a fuse which ignited explosions across in the world of Christian service and healthcare. And if we have ears to hear, it can ignite further explosions today. And right from the earliest days of the Christian church, the community freely engaged in sacrificial service of one another and of the lowest of the low, the dying, the lepers, the babies. And that's why the slave's towel becomes the brand image of the ICMDA. That's what it is. It's probably, in reality, not half as nice and white. I mean, can you imagine what the real towel looked like? But that's what it is. It's our brand image, the servant's towel. Just as the Father has sent me, in the same way I send you. And just thinking about humble service, I didn't plan to say this, but just like Andre, I feel a question for the older people here. You may have stopped your professional service now, and a question I want to ask you, and we need to think about, is what are old people for? I mean, there's an awful lot of them around. There seem to be getting more and more of them. What are old people, including myself? I'm talking to myself. What are we for? Well, here are some suggestions what we're for. Servant-heartedness, investing in the next generation. That's this spiritual friendship, life wisdom, availability, encouragement, prayer. Can I gently challenge you? What are the good works that God has prepared beforehand for you now, at this time of your life? And then Jesus was sent to care. And here you know the familiar story of Jesus who meets an anonymous stranger in Luke 7, a sad little funeral procession, the widow. And she's the only son, and the son's been snatched away. She's already lost her husband. But, you know, that little sad story is not unusual. It's actually happened all the time. Mortality was high, widows were common, life is hard. But Luke points out something amazing. He says, when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her. That's what it says in the English. Actually, the Greek word is much more powerful, splanknizde, and it comes, of course, from splanknic, the splanchnic nerves, if you've done your anatomy, and you were using that God-given brain. And so it's about the guts. It's about the bowels. He was gutted. He was emotionally involved. He wasn't just disinterested. You know, as health professionals, we frequently come into contact with strangers who are facing tragedy. And yet sometimes it's suggested that we should be cool and professional. We shouldn't allow ourselves to become involved. I strongly believe that that's wrong. I think we are called to be involved with a suffering stranger as Jesus was involved, to respond in the depths of our being. But that means opening ourselves out to the pain that is around us, because we're surrounded by people who are hurting, like Jesus. And empathy with hurting people is painful. But I believe it's an essential component of Christian caring, entering into the pain in order to be the presence. I came across this quote some years ago, and it's meant a lot to me. Suffering is not a question which demands an answer. It's not a problem which demands a solution. It's a mystery which demands a presence. A mystery which demands a presence. So, our first calling with people who suffer and struggle is to be Jesus, to be the presence of Jesus. Whenever we talk about painful issues like abortion and infertility and dementia and euthanasia, we must talk about it with tears in our eyes, not with judgment or rhetoric or harshness in our voices. In the old slogan, your patient won't care how much you know until they know how much you care. So you and I have the unbelievable privilege of being Christ in the particular place where he placed you. When you walk into that cubicle in A&E, when you go into that clinic, when you join that ward round, when you walk into the operating room, you're bringing Christ into that place. And in the chance contingencies that happen, which God has prepared for you, there are good works. I was once walking down the corridor in our hospital. It was lunchtime. I'd had a busy morning. My mind was on something else. And you know what hospital corridors are? Hundreds of people. And as we were walking along the corridor, I happened to notice a heavily pregnant woman coming the other way, and she was weeping, and she was being supported by a midwife. And as we grew opposite one another, the midwife recognized me and said, "Oh, Professor Wyatt, you should talk to Professor Wyatt." So we went off into this little room near the neonatal unit, and it turned out that she was carrying triplets. She was 18 weeks pregnant. She'd just come down from the fetal medicine unit, where they had strongly suggested, virtually forced her, recommended to her, a selective reduction to kill one of the 3 babies in order to give a better chance of survival. And they'd said she's a very high risk of brain damage, of prematurity. And so we talked about it, and I took around the neonatal unit. We looked at some very premature babies. I said, we had cared for some triplets, and yes, there were increased risks, but actually many of them, the majority, did very well. And then they left, and she left, and I didn't hear anything else. And about 4 months later, I was working on the neonatal unit and said, "There's someone to see you outside." So I go outside, and there she is with her partner, and there are 3 babies. And it was strange looking at them and thinking, if we hadn't just met in the corridor, maybe one of those babies wouldn't be there. So, many Christian doctors and carers could give lots of examples like that. We just happen to be in the right place at the right time. And despite all our failures and weaknesses, we were given grace to say the right thing and do the right thing. So you have to be prepared. Every day actually turns into an adventure. Lord, give me eyes to see what you're up to. I don't need to try and force an opportunity to serve or speak about Christ. I just need to keep my eyes and my ears open, my heart in the right attitude. And that means every day, before you walk into that A&E cubicle, you need to prepare yourself. I've learned this painfully over the years. You have to pray before you hit the hospital. You have to make sure you're in the right place. But whenever we say that something is wrong, we must immediately say, and here is a better way. And this is part of Christian caring again. And one of the examples I haven't time to talk about in any detail is Cicely Saunders, a wonderful lady who invented a whole new way of caring for dying people. And she understood one of the great slides, one of the great slogans was this: you don't have to kill the patient in order to kill the pain. I really wish that Lord Carey would understand that. You don't have to kill the patient in order to kill the pain. This is compassion. And she said, you have to deal with total pain. Here we are: physical pain, psychological pain, relational pain, spiritual pain.